just want to give you a quick update on a couple of things before handing over to Adam. Firstly, I must thank member Paul from Fresh Air, who's produced a video. Some of you may have seen it. We've put it around on all our social media channels and our website. It's about a safe return to work video.
Yeah, that's fine. No problem at all.
Oh, no, it's not.
Alrighty, no worries.
Let me just mute everyone. There we go. Alrighty, no worries from somebody. So that video, the animation is brilliant, and it's a really good reminder to our visitors to the chamber about how to work safely and what we're doing about social distancing. So Paul at Fresh Air has done a cracking job, and you could do that for your organisation if you'd like. Just as a sort of intro to Adam, I don't think, and I hope you'd agree, I don't think you've ever seen the Chamber lobbying so hard and working so hard at a national level on your behalf. I've been really proud to be part of this network and to see the results of that hard lobbying. I know Adam will tell you that he speaks to Rishi Sunak and Alex Sharma on a regular basis, and that he's been pushing all the issues you have, and it's led to the introduction of the coronavirus job retention scheme, and its extension has got the fingerprints of the Chamber of Commerce all over it, and they have listened and responded very well to all our requests. I won't steal Adam's thunder. I'm sure he'll tell us about where there may be some gaps that we're still pushing on, but largely it's been a significant success for the Chamber network to have such fantastic results and to have such a good relationship that they've listened to all our needs and largely met them. I'm sure Adam will tell us about where there are things still to do and where we need your help, because often it's a case of not being anecdotal. It's easy to say our members say or our members want, but where you're prepared to confidentially give evidence of where your issues are, the needs you have, the costs you're experiencing in returning to work safely, in putting in separation, that's the sort of thing we need to know. If you don't tell us, we can't campaign for you. And what we really need is those real world examples of what you need. Without further ado, I will hand over to Dr. Adam Marshall, Director General of British Chambers of Commerce.
Thank you, Stuart, very much. I'm sorry that I'm one of those who say that the mountain beard has to go.
That's fair enough.
I've got a pretty clear steer from colleagues on the line on that particular point. But listen, thank you everyone for joining today. Thank you for giving up your time as well. And I'm under instructions to speak to you for 20 minutes, but I will probably be significantly shorter than that, because my priority here today is actually to hear from you, because it's the 53 chambers around the UK and the experiences and issues facing our business communities that we are here to try to do something about at the BCC. So my absolute priority is ensuring that I know what the Devon and Plymouth business community is thinking right now, what the key issues are, and where we can do whatever we can to help on your behalf. Stuart has been, and the team have been, very effective advocates, I think, of the area and of the Southwest more widely. And we are more than aware of some of the big issues specifically facing the region. We've been banging the drum, for example, on the question of tourism, hospitality and leisure, given the disproportionate impact on those particular sectors and on the region as a whole. We've also heard about some of the other issues arising around business finance and a range of other things. So rest assured, you're well represented within the national network, and then we will do our very best in turn to try to support and represent you. I wanted to try to cover sort of three things, if I can, for a few minutes. The first is talk a little bit about what we have done to date. The second is to say words about where I think we are now. And then the third, very logically, is to talk a little bit about what we see coming ahead of us over the next few months. So on the first, in terms of what we've done to date, I'd like to think that we as a chamber network responded and reacted very quickly when we saw the lockdown coming in mid-March, and when we saw the likelihood that significant swathes of our economy were going to be shut down. we identified pretty quickly that a lot of businesses were going to see a drop off in demand that was almost total, more or less instantly, and that most would never have seen such a fall off in demand so sharp or so steep. We also identified that people who are working around Whitehall and Westminster, as ever, don't understand enough about the reality on the ground in our local business communities, and that we had a job to do to try to find out what was going on and then explain it to them as clearly as possible, so that whatever steps they were going to take to support business more generally didn't miss the mark. And what we managed to do through those two things, I think, was to influence the formation of some of the government schemes to support our business communities. If you take the loan schemes, we'd identified working capital as being a huge problem for a lot of businesses. Now, of course, we probably would have liked to have seen more grants than loans than we ended up with in the ultimate mix. But getting those loan schemes both put in place and then up and running, and then particularly at the smallest end of the market, actually making them faster and easier to access was a big priority for us right from the start. With the grants that were announced, our biggest priority was we were scared that the money was going to get stuck in local authorities and wasn't going to get to the businesses that needed them as quickly as possible. So you had firms eligible for £10,000 and £25,000 grants that would have been significant in terms of keeping the workforce on, in terms of maintaining business. And our worry was they'd get stuck in bureaucratic processes and not get out the door as quickly as possible. So as a network, we were able to take action and try to ensure that there was pressure there and a league table there to make sure that grants were getting out quickly to businesses. And then, of course, I think the most important of the interventions so far has been the furlough scheme, the job retention scheme. And just by a show of thumbs up, from those on the call, if it's not betraying any confidences, can I ask, have businesses on the call used the job retention scheme at all, the furlough scheme? Do you have employees on furlough at the moment? Quite a few. Yeah. And to be honest with you, we identified very early on, again, through that research, through that conversation and that interaction with our business communities and through our business impacts tracker, that a lot of businesses were going to need support to keep their workforce on. Otherwise, they would face serious and immediate redundancies. So you may have seen fairly early on in the process predictions that we would have 9 million people on the furlough scheme based on a British Chambers of Commerce survey. The likelihood is that many of you filled in that survey, that business impacts tracker for us when we were starting this process. And indeed, today there are 8.9 million jobs being supported by the furlough scheme, almost the exact number that was predicted by our survey. So the information that you give us that we are then able to use on your behalf with senior politicians actually does make a real difference. So a big thank you from us for engaging a lot, engaging fast, and engaging often with the Chamber, because that makes all the difference to us trying to do positive things to support you in turn. We also said to government that a furlough scheme that only lasted for a couple of months wasn't going to save very many jobs, and that when support was removed, it couldn't simply be the rug pulled out from under our businesses. And they've responded again in turn. The furlough scheme was supposed to end at the end of June. It now goes through the end of October, and there's the start of a taper there. And I would not be surprised if we get into the autumn that we see, rather than the firm ending, the scheme ending completely, that we see a further taper along as time continues. And we certainly will be examining that as well, to try to support as many businesses to return to normality as smoothly as possible, rather than just see a key bit of support kicked out from underneath them. So we have had involvement in some of the very significant schemes that are now supporting our business communities. And I can't emphasize enough that it's engagement with a local chamber that makes that possible and allows us to take the fight to our friends in Westminster and Whitehall. As Stuart said, they've been very receptive to what chambers and the BCC have had to say on behalf of business communities. I've been speaking with the Governor of the Bank of England every fortnight on what's going on in the real economy and what we're seeing across the Chamber network, because the Bank of England spends a lot of time thinking about its interventions based on the input that we put in. Similarly, I meet with the business secretary once or twice, literally every week. The last conversation was one just last Friday on leveling up the UK economy and what needs to be done in order to help regions outside the southeast. And with other ministers and senior officials too, we're in more or less constant contact and communication. Per Stuart's point earlier, one of the things that helped us most during this process was when we could bring stories from particular businesses to bear with the politicians. Because when we give them abstract numbers, sometimes they say one thing and they say, oh, yes, that's all fine. Yes, we understand. But when we explain to them the particular circumstances facing a business in Barnstaple, say, or in Plymouth or wherever else it might be in the county, and the particular circumstances that they're facing, they respond differently. So the more case studies, the more stories from your own business that you're able to feed to Stuart and the team, the more likely we are, again, to try to get change on your behalf. So thank you to those of you who fed those stories in during the early and most acute stages of the crisis. So that's where we've been. Where are we now? Quite frankly, I think we are in the eye of the storm right now, everyone. I'm not sure if all of you would agree with that, or if you think that we're in a slightly different position. So we've been through the first wave of terrible squalls, terrible difficulty, and terrible danger. And we're now in a period where things are temporarily a bit calmer. But every big storm, of course, has that calm center, and then the second half of the squall comes in. And I think we still have that to go. And that is going to, I think, manifest itself this autumn. Why do I say that? Well, we see that firms are still facing significant cash pressure. And most companies only have between 1 and 3 months cash in reserve. So when bank forbearance comes to an end and people have to pay off loans and mortgages again, you'll have more of a cash crunch. When seasonal businesses get to the end of this summer, and I know in your area that's a particularly acute question right now, if they haven't had a good summer, another cash crunch. Another one next year as well, when the CBILS and bounce back loan schemes, the interest-free periods and the capital repayment holidays come to an end, and people have to start paying that money back. So we can see where waves of different sort of cash crunch points are coming for businesses over the coming months. Unfortunately, I'd agree with those who think that all of the support that's been put in place isn't going to be enough to prevent some substantial redundancies from happening. We're going to see them. But the message that I'm trying to put to central government is, don't just focus on the small number of very big companies and household names that are being forced to make people redundant because of business conditions. Look at those who are making 5 and 10 and 50 and 100 people redundant as well through this period, because that's where you're going to have the real impact in local economies, in employment, and where some of the scarring effects, as the economists call it, the long-term danger, that's where that's going to come from. So what we're trying to do at the moment is to understand from you, from Chamber Business Communities, and I know this is a sensitive topic, whether as the furlough scheme pulls back, whether you think you've got redundancies coming ahead. If so, what kind of support might be needed in order to preserve jobs where they are viable and where the business thinks that it sees demand can return down the road as well. But we do think there'll be some difficulties coming in that respect. And I think we have to be ready for that. The flip side of it, which is where there's some optimism, is that some businesses, as they restart, are going to see an almost immediate return in demand and will be able to trade well out of this. So not every business is going to be in that negative situation. There'll be some in a more positive situation. And what we need to do is to ensure that they have both as much support and as much clarity of guidance as to what's permitted and what isn't as is possible in order to navigate that situation. Looking ahead down the road, the Chancellor in a few weeks' time and the Prime Minister are going to be making some statements about where they see the economy and what additional support they think needs to be put in place. And my team is working literally right now on what we would say on behalf of Chamber Business Communities in that space. And the way we're dividing it up is into sort of 3 buckets. And I'd be interested again in your feedback on this. One is on the supply side. So what can governments do to try to get the supply side going again? And there I think about things like infrastructure projects that everyone has known has been ready for a long time, and all you have to do is go ahead and deliver them. dropping some of the regulatory and compliance measures that businesses have to go through, which is just bureaucracy. It's not actually helping safety, security, or the environment. If it's just bureaucracy, can you pull some of that back for a while to give businesses room to focus on getting the P&L back in shape rather than compliance with lots of government bureaucracy? Those kinds of measures on the supply side are going to be very important. On the demand side, we need to get confidence back into the economy. And there you're thinking about both consumer confidence and business confidence. So we're going to need to see some incentives to get consumers going again. And that could be through something, for example, like a cut to VAT that is temporary and targeted. But we also need to see some incentives to get businesses investing too. Because even though there are some businesses for whom cash is really short right now, there are a lot of other businesses sitting on quite a lot of cash. And this would be a great time to incentivize them to spend that money in their local business communities to improve their own productivity, improve their own supply chains, get better at what they do. So bigger capital allowances, bigger investment allowances, things that will get businesses moving again on the investment side are going to be really important. And then the final area we're looking at, when we look to the Chancellor's statement, is around resilience. So what can be done now to help businesses become more resilient in case there's another shock coming down the line? Whether that's a second wave or future waves of the pandemic, or whether it's through some other black swan event that comes at us from left field that we didn't know we were going to be facing. We want to make sure that we've increased the resilience in our business communities. And that can be everything like helping companies lower costs, helping them source more, for example, within the UK, rather than having to depend on long international supply chains. There's a lot of factors there too. So supply side and demand side measures and resilience is what we're looking at, to argue to the Chancellor and to the Prime Minister over the coming weeks. And we'll also be looking at, over the longer term, at what needs to be done to support the economy. Our view, and it'd be interesting to see if you believe the same, is that if the government were to say, okay, in response to all the money we've just spent supporting the economy, we're going to pull back on spending and go into a period of austerity, and we're going to raise taxes on businesses and individuals in order to pay off some of the extra debt we've got. We think that would be counterproductive right now, because we're in a position where if you do that, demand just shrinks right back and you never can really restart the economy the way that you would want to. So the argument we've made to the UK government is, now's the time to have an expansive fiscal position. Yes, debt is concerning, but right now what should be more concerning is economic activity that just doesn't return after the shutdown that we've had and after the lockdown that we've had. So we don't want to see taxes raised on businesses or individuals, and we don't want to see the public spending taps turned off, particularly on infrastructure, which I know particularly in the Southwest is a massive issue. Whether it's improvements to the resilience of the rail lines, whether it's dualling of the A30 and the A38, all of the projects we've all been talking about forever and ever, amen. We know that those still need to happen, and we also know that shutting off the taps now would be incredibly counterproductive. So it's not the usual stance you'd hear from a business organization that would say, don't spend too much money, live within your means as a government. And right now we're going to need an expansive government fiscal policy so that the private sector can start to refloat again. And we think that will be really important going forward. So just to conclude, it's what you tell us that lets us do things that matter and that make a difference. So thank you for all that you do to contribute to the Chamber. I look forward to the discussion. And with that, Stuart, can I hand back to you?
Thank you, Adam. That was really interesting, and I'm sure our people will have loads of questions for you, and I'll look for hands up in the participant box and the chat box as well. So if anyone's got any questions they want to ask us. I'll start off because I've had a few already. So you've touched on bounce back. You touched on the difficulties that business will face coming out the other side. How quickly can we bounce back, do you think, if the government behaves? And do you think the government will listen to the campaigns that say this is a once in a generation event, it should be treated like the Second World War, we almost treat that as a different bank account and we pay it back over 50 or 60 years? And if they do that, how likely is it, and how quickly do you think we can bounce back as an economy?
I think they are listening on that. I think there are two schools of thought they're dealing with at the moment. One is the Treasury orthodoxy, which is, you know, after a spending spree, you always pull back, and the other is this is not normal times, and you must continue to act, as you say, Stuart, like a wartime situation. Obviously, our analysis favors the latter. We think that this is a very unique set of circumstances. We've never seen a 20% fall in GDP in a month, which is what we had from the official statistics in April on Friday. So this needs to be treated like a wartime situation. And I think that most in government at the moment are listening to that. So I think we will have an accommodative set of policies, you know, over the next few months. On the speed of bounce back, I think anyone who tries to tell you that they understand that fully might be selling a bit of snake oil right now. And the reason I say that is because there's so many different variables involved in this thing here, that if someone's predicting a V-shaped recovery or a U-shaped recovery or an L-shaped recovery or whatever else it might be, you know, do they have the information necessary to do that yet? And I think the answer is no, we just don't. So given that's the case, we haven't made any predictions like that. And, you know, we would normally publish an economic forecast, but there's too many different things going on right now in order to do so. Today, some of what we see today will be the first indicators of what could happen. So non-essential retail shops reopening today, and there were queues in Birmingham and Manchester and a number of other cities today for people with pent-up demand saying they wanted to get back into the shops. If that continues, we have one of our first indicators of what's going on. When I spoke last to the leadership of the Bank of England, one of the debates was whether the money that people have squirreled away during this period, because people have started saving a lot more during this period, are they going to go out and spend it when lockdown ends? Or are they going to hang on to it because they might be worried about losing their jobs? So seeing where that lands over the next month or two is going to be really, really important as well to the speed and pace of the recovery. But because we don't know all of that, that's why we think you should be doubling down on infrastructure right now. You know, government projects that can be delivered, that stick to the sides for the long term and that will still be benefiting from 60 years from now, are good things to do right now. So we'll certainly be following up on that.
I completely agree. I sense there is a lot of pent-up demand in a lot of quarters. From personal experience, I was watching a car during the furlough period that I wanted to buy the minute that the lockdown was lifted to allow me to buy a car, and it went within about 3 seconds of it being lifted. I looked at a house, and thankfully I have secured the house, but 13 people viewed it in 2 days when viewings were allowed. So I think there is a lot of pent-up demand there. So I see Tim Jones has got his hand up, and then we'll go to Jason Berry. So Tim, would you like to come in there?
Oh, hi, Adam. Thanks for very helpful analysis. Just a couple of observations, then a question, if I may. I think your emphasis on infrastructure investment is absolutely 100% right. I think perhaps the additional stimulus we need there is to make sure that in parallel with that, there are planning reforms introduced. The planning refresh is overdue. I think there's a pretty broad hint from government that they're looking at some significant adjustments, but historically we've seen major infrastructure projects held up for years through objections and consultation processes, etc., the NIMBY lobby. So perhaps that's the bit that we need to add into that agenda. I think again, your comments about tapering on furloughing are right, but the plea for the hospitality and leisure industry, clearly they're going to be the last to come out of the lockdown. That's the area that's hurting at the most, so tapering there probably would be most beneficial. But for me, the bit that really isn't central to the discussion at the moment is this emerging black hole in apprenticeships and what on earth we can do about that. So any lobbying that you might feel enabled to introduce into that agenda, I think would be hugely helpful.
Thanks, Tim. I totally agree with you. One of the things I neglected to mention is that, you know, when we look at all past crises, who gets hurt the most? It's Black and minority ethnic people, it's women, and it's young people get hurt in every crisis the most. And a lot of that is because of structural inequality and issues in the economy that we have never dealt with properly. And I don't think this crisis will be any different. So we do need to focus on some of those groups that are going to be hit the most by this, and make sure that policy can respond to it. I'm as worried as you are about apprenticeships, to be completely honest with you. What business in their right mind is going to start employing lots of people that they have to not just pay, but also put a huge amount of resource into training right now if they can't see where their demand is coming from? And when we see our leaders standing up and talking about an apprenticeship guarantee, they're not dealing with, for example, the demand from the employer themselves. Is the employer able to actually take that on at the moment? So, one of the things we're looking at is, what do you do around apprenticeships? We're also looking at, what do you do around helping people retrain when they've fallen out of the workforce as well? Because we're really worried that we'll get some structural unemployment that sticks around for a long time for people who've been in jobs for 10, 20 or 30 years and who find it very difficult to switch to something else or to find something in the new economy that comes next. So completely take your point and completely agree with you, and know we've got a lot of work to do. I don't have all the answers on that one right now. Hospitality and leisure, totally agree as well. What we're doing is we're saying we're not going to focus on furlough. We're going to focus on what the next stage in government support is for those industries that are particularly affected. Hospitality, leisure, tourism, aviation in particular are the ones you would think of where the effect is going to be long lasting and be around with us for a while. And we're looking at what's the next stage in support there.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you, Tim. There was another question in the chat privately to me about apprenticeships and what's BCC stance on using the apprenticeship levy to support non-apprenticeship skills training. And Adam, just to add my own point to that before I come to Jason, who's had his hand up patiently for some time. You remember I pushed BCC before coronavirus hit about perhaps extending the annual investment allowance. So instead of being just covering plant, machinery and that sort of thing, but could the annual investment allowance be extended to cover training? Because that'd be a very tax efficient way. And I think that's a quick ask BCC could have. So any thoughts on that briefly before I go to Jason?
You'd be unsurprised to it that the ask to extend the annual investment allowance to cover training, to cover premises, as well as plant and machinery is still an ask that we're making. We think they should keep it at $1 million or even make it bigger, and that it should be able to cover all of those things, not just plant and machinery for manufacturers. We think and logistics businesses, we think it should go more broadly than that. Because if you let businesses capitalize an expense like a significant training investment, they might be more willing to make that investment in the first place. So the logic's still there, and it's still very much part of our policy thinking. Using the apprenticeship levy to cover non-apprenticeship skills training, we've also been in favor of a wider use for the levy. Ministers never have been. They're saying this is for apprenticeships and not for anything else. So we're bashing our heads against a brick wall with that one a little bit. But our hope is that actually you could use the levy money to do whatever is as responsive as possible businesses need coming out of this crisis. But that's a longer term one. It's going to take us a little longer to get there.
Thank you, Adam. And Jason, you've lowered your hand, but I guess you still want to ask the question. Jason, you've waited very patiently. Come in there, Jason.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Adam. Lovely to hear your thoughts, and I virtually agree with everything you've virtually said, to be fair. I do think I hope there'll be a large Buy British sort of campaign moving forward. And a couple of questions really. When Rishi Sunak announced the self-employment furloughing, he did allude to an overhaul of the tax system, and I don't know if you've seen or heard anything about that in regards to, I guess, PLCs and self-employed, where they're trying to make maximum use of the tax system, and now, of course, reverse maximum use of the furloughing system. So there's that question as well, and also that whilst we're going through an economic shock, that generations will remember. There's the small element of Brexit.
Oh yes,
and that's sort of come up last week when Michael Gove's announced that we would not be looking for an extension to transition. I just don't know if there's enough brain capacity in businesses and ministers and civil servants to cope with both of those, economic changes. And I just want to know your thoughts.
Sure. Okay, how long have we got? On Buy British, what we're encouraging companies to think about right now is, how do you make your supply chain as resilient as you possibly can? In a lot of cases, that will mean buying closer to home. but not in all cases, because it might be that buying closer to home is 500% more expensive than buying from somewhere else overseas, and your business just can't wear that. So we've just talked about it in terms of resilience and in terms of businesses shortening their supply chains or making sure that they have other options available to them. And a lot of companies will want to buy domestically because that's part of their brand, it's part of who they are, it's part of their sense of corporate, social, and local responsibility. And we would, of course, encourage that wherever businesses want to. And indeed, I know a lot of chambers are also running buy local campaigns as well, encouraging people to get as much as possible within their regions. And you know, one of the things we're looking at the moment for the Chancellor's statement is whether there should be some time-limited vouchers allowing people to buy things from local businesses in a business-to-consumer context to try to get the, you know, money circulating in local economies again. So I think there's a groundswell of support and understanding for that. Plus, as long as international borders remain tricky and businesses are having difficulties shipping stuff around logistically, which has proven to be the case for a lot of companies during this period, if you can get it from a domestic manufacturer at the moment, it doesn't sound so expensive anymore if you know you're going to get it when you need it. You know, so even if there's a price differential, a lot of businesses are saying, I know I'll be able to get it because it's coming down an A road, not on a ship, you know, transiting 3 different countries. So I think we'll see more of that. But I don't think we'll see mass import substitution, though, at all. Every time people have said that we would have that, it's never worked and it never has the desired effect. So I think we'll still be open to the world, but a lot of people will be making more conscious procurement decisions going forward. On the self-employed and the future tax system, the Chancellor's threat was clear as day. I'm equalizing contributions for national insurance for the self-employed as for the employed after this. I heard that signal loud and clear, but he's not the first Chancellor to suggest it or to try to do it only to get their fingers burnt. So we'll have to see whether that actually ends up happening. But you know, there is a fairness argument here, which is if the state is going to support a particular group, is that particular group paying into the safety net required in order to make sure that that support can be there in the future? And I think that's a legitimate argument for a government to put forward and for us as a business community to contribute to. Just as we've contributed to the discussions about those businesses who are religious in paying all of their tax obligations, including corporation tax, where there are other businesses setting up the double Dutch, triple Irish tax avoidance schemes so as not to pay much corporation tax in this country. That's a healthy debate, and I think it's one we'll have over the coming months. But I would be very unsurprised to see every group that has benefited from some level of support be subject to scrutiny as to what they need to put into the pot for resilience the next time we have a problem. So if I were self-employed today, I would be saying, I would anticipate that I'm going to be asked to make a contribution in solidarity for the future on this, because I've just had 2 grants that have helped to replace significant parts of my income off the state.
Thank you, Adam.
And then on Brexit, there was Brexit still to go. Sorry.
I've got questions about Brexit, and I'll come back to those in a moment. Russ, right. I can see your hands up, and you've been incredibly patient. I'll come to you in just a second, but just to further on the local procurement point while we can. So I was on a call with Plymouth City Council earlier, who told me, and forgive me, I don't know the timescales, it's the one bit I missed and I must find out, but they used to have 14% of their procurement locally. I believe this was in one council tenure. They now have over 50%, and the Chamber's pushing really hard to get that higher again. I sit on Carolyn Giles, who's on the call, sits on the Inclusive Growth Board, and she'll tell you that there's a lot of talk about making local procurement score highly if they help the local agenda for inclusive growth. So that's really important. And so with that, there was a question, I think Paul at Fresh Air wanted to ask a question about local procurement, then I'll come to you, Russ, just because it links in.
Yeah, I was going to say, naturally, there's been a focus on getting the high streets and consumerism back on track. Yeah. And you also mentioned about the emphasis on things like construction and infrastructure, which naturally tends to, every element of those projects tend to go to much bigger businesses. With LRG, local and regional government, in mind, what do you think can be really done to actively encourage local and regional government to procure locally? And I don't necessarily mean procure locally in terms of getting it from a regional division of a much larger company, or just going to a much larger company, albeit within the same postcode. But with regards to alleviating the difficulty that smaller micro businesses have to go forward for tendering opportunities, tendering, for example, is inherently an expensive operation to go through, and actually encouraging LRG to approach micro businesses and make it easier for them to compete.
It's a great question, Paul. The answer I always give sounds a bit distant from the question, but bear with me for a second, if you will. It's really around social value, and it's around convincing local and regional governments that they need to abandon the old spreadsheet cost methodology, just what's the cheapest and that's what we buy, and start looking at what benefits are added to the area over the lifetime of the procurement and beyond the procurement, that are worth us taking into consideration. Because I can guarantee, as you say, that the smaller micro business that you're talking about is not going to likely be the cheapest one out there to do the job, but they may be employing 3 people locally, supporting a local charity, and renovating a building in a rundown community, or whatever else it might be. So our encouragement for sort of looking at the future of economic strategy is actually looking at how procurement is used differently. And interestingly, leaving the EU procurement system, if in fact we disentangle ourselves from the state aid rules as they exist right now, could enable more creative thinking in that space, because you're not tied to a very sort of rigid model there. I never hold my breath when it comes to UK authorities and procurement. The reason is because we've made the European system complicated than most of our colleagues on the continent over the years. So it's not actually the fault of the system, it's our own fault for gold plating it over time. But there is an opportunity, I think, to look at it again. And it really is whole life costs, social value, and understanding the contribution that procurement has to a community that has to form a bigger part of the methodology. Funnily enough, I think central government has been better at this than local and regional government has. Local councils and local NHS trusts are always brought up by chamber members as being the big ones on some of this stuff. They're the ones applying the rules most strictly, where actually central government is actually now doing a lot better at procuring from SMEs. So hopefully we can progress this. This is a 5 to 10 year fight, though. I think it's not going to be one that we solve in 5 to 10 years, but it is one that very much is on our radar.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question, Paul, and thank you, Adam, for that. Finally, Russ, I've finally made it back to you.
Problem.
Please do, go ahead.
No problem. Excellent discussion and some really good thoughts on the call. My question really is around R&D tax credits and whether there's an appetite to perhaps provide advanced tax credits based on year to date, end of June, say. Our situation is, we're a group of 8 UK entities that have been in a R&D phase for the last 4 years. So we don't have the 2019 turnover to make any meaningful CBILS or bounce back loan scheme funding available. So we kind of fallen through the net. One thing that we have benefited from over the years is the R&D tax credits. And given that this is something that would come to us anyway during the course of 2021, do you think that there is an appetite through HMRC to assist by allowing us to put in a tax credit request, not just for year end 2019, but also for the first 6 months of 2020?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, Russ. The feedback I've had from around the chamber network is that HMRC, despite being really good with the furlough scheme and getting that up and running really quickly, has actually got slower on R&D tax credit processing. Right. And is actually having more difficulty dealing with the number of inquiries they're getting on R&D tax credits recently. I'm guessing they shifted a lot of their resources into dealing with the immediate crisis and thought, this is something we can put off until a bit later. I'll have to ask my team to bring it up with our colleagues and contacts at HMRC. I suppose the issue that immediately arises for me is if it's a tax credit, it's being offset against something, right? So giving it to people in advance is giving it to them on the supposition that there will be something to offset it down the road. Am I right in understanding that?
Sure, but if we can provide evidence of invoices of R&D spend, say up to the end of June this year, then we can provide the evidence. You know, this isn't intended spend for the second half of the year, calendar year.
Yeah. So it's a really good question. I'll have to raise it with my team because, to be honest with you, my knowledge doesn't extend far enough to give you a good answer. But it's almost like taking an R&D tax credit and making it into an R&D upfront grant,
Yes.
but with some guarantees around it that the business actually has something happening that will have it later on down the line.
Sure, because not normally our accountants would process it post year end, so early, you know, basically in 9 months' time, then put the application in, which can take another 8 to 12 weeks.
Let us take that one away because it's an interesting proposition, and you know what, it helps the whole productivity question, because if you're trying to get businesses to invest a lot in stuff, you want to give them good incentives and good tax credits at the right moment in time to help their working capital.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you. So Russ, could you put your contact details in the chat, and we'll make sure we follow that up with BCC and come back to you when we get a response. And thank you for that. And many of you on the call will know that when you have forwarded stuff to me with the question that goes to BCC, they're very responsive and they do follow these things up. So so please do, as we said at the start, make sure that you let Adam and his team know what your issues are, and we will get those answers for you. There was just to bring up a question, well, more of an observation, I think, in the chat, saying there are a number of self-employed individuals who receive no help. Should they be exempt from payback? If we equalise contributions, we need to equalise the benefits too, such as sick leave and maternity pay. So I think that's in relation, Adam, to that question about if he starts taxing self-employed the same as other people. And there's also another question about directors who've paid themselves through repayment of directors' loans and dividends. Is there any news on that, or any hope that we're going to see a resolution to that?
Well, I mean, we have been campaigning on it because it's been brought up by members literally across the country that owner directors paying themselves through dividends have literally been left out of most of the schemes. You know, a few have been able to benefit by part furloughing themselves. But you know, your income going down to 500 or 600 quid a month in a lot of cases because they were taking very small salaries out of business and paying themselves most through dividends. I am not optimistic at this stage that we are likely to see new categories of support for people who have not already been helped through the initial phase of the crisis. That doesn't mean that I'm not going to pound my head against the wall, because I will continue pounding my head against the wall and saying that owner directors, new starters who started after the 23rd of March in a particular business who had taken an offer of employment, but their payroll details were informed to HMRC too late, etc., etc. We're trying to highlight all of those groups and say something should be done here, because you've got a number of people who are innovative entrepreneurs who are key to restarting the economy who've literally had no help through this period. And again, the same arguments about fairness that one would make to self-employed, saying you've got to pay in order to take out. These individuals, also should be subjected to the same logic, the same analysis, that if they have paid in a certain amount, what do they get out? And the proposal that we've made on directors was around saying, take the 3-year average of the dividends that they've taken out of the business over those 3 years, and get a mechanism in place to identify what is a dividend on the basis of actual business, as opposed to property investments or other forms of investment. Because HMRC's big concern here was they were saying, well, we can't really differentiate between dividends paid out to shell to beneficial owners of shell companies from dividends that are a form of salary, effectively, that people are taking out of their owner managed businesses. Now, if they find a solution to that, then we think they should be trying to help. So we'll keep at it, but I'm not too optimistic, Stuart, at this stage.
Absolutely, and I'm going to move on just because we want to cover the dreaded B word. There's something that went quiet for a while, and we were almost glad it did, but now it's coming back. Just before I do, I mean, my point on that with the director's dividends is it can't be right that businesses fail because of the personal circumstances of the individual director. So that could lead to redundancies and business failures just because the individual director is insolvent. That can't be right. There's got to be a way to save those businesses. Ali Carnegie, I know you've got a question about energy. If it's okay, if I can fit that in at the end, I will. But I think the B question, I'll start off with the will and should the transition period be extended?
Well, Chamber members, unsurprisingly, around the country have been as divided on this particular issue as they have been since before the referendum in 2015, 2016, when we started surveying this topic. So we've not expressed a view as to whether the transition should be extended or not. The government's already made a clear political decision that it will not request an extension of the transition. If that's the case, and the 31st of December is the end of transition, then they've got a hell of a lot of work to do to answer all of the big questions that businesses are facing about how they can trade successfully across borders from January the 1st of next year. And I feel like my job is to hold them to explanations to those questions. Exactly what are the processes, what are the procedures, what are the requirements, and what are the no regrets investments, choices, and courses of action that businesses should be taking right now in order to prepare for that change. They owe us that clarity.
Yeah.
We had a win last week, I think you mentioned right at the beginning, which was around the government doing a U-turn on imports and on what it's going to demand of people for goods coming into the country. I think that's the right decision to make. You've got to sort of ease in a new regime, and making the border as simple as possible for businesses in the first instance as they get used to change is going to be very, very important. It'll also help with our food supplies and various other essential things that are important. But there's still more to do. And I'm a lot of time talking to Michael Gove's office, talking to Penny Mordaunt and others who are very much involved in this. And we're going to go back to that list of unanswered questions, which many of you may have seen the Chamber put out, in the run up to the last sets of deadlines. And we will be upping our noise on this over the next few months. Can businesses deal with the 1-2 punch of coronavirus and Brexit? We hear two different arguments, and just coming back to your question there. One is no, they can't, and it's going to be really difficult. And the other argument is, well, if international trade volumes are down 30 to 40% on their pre-coronavirus peak, if ever you were going to do a disconnection, now's the time to do it. So least damage at that particular moment in time. Both of those arguments are in circulation. I'm not endorsing either of them. I'm just saying that they're both what I hear. So I have no doubt it will be rocky and it will be difficult. But we've also done something as a chamber network, which Stuart and others have been involved in, which is we are doing our best to train up our people in order to be able to help businesses with customs declarations. So when those import and export declarations are going to be required, we want every business to go to their local chamber and get that support, just like they do for export documentation right now. We want the chamber to be there and in a position to help. And we've trained 140 customs agents for the past 18 months across the chamber network, and we have plans to do more. So what we're trying to do is to be as practical as we can on Brexit and say, we need the questions answered and we'll do whatever we can to help businesses.
Thank you, Adam. I know we've got Linda Middleton-Jones on the line from International Trade Matters, and she's not only deals with that, but training in international trade for the Chamber. And I'm sure you believe passionately that the international trade is still very important. So even if we are severing ties, there's much more we can do there. Linda, is there anything you wanted to say on that point? You're on mute. There you go.
Well, yeah, I'd just like to say that at the moment what's coming out of the DIT is first protocol is the DIT ITAs, the International Trade Advisors. I would like the chambers to be making much more of actually, we can help. We've got people who understand about exporting and importing, and we're an important port of call. I think if there could be some pressure, Adam, from BCC on that, a recognition of the expertise that we have throughout the country, that would be wonderful. I think there are more than one route to success, and if we're going to go for a global Britain, each of us need to know where to go to be able to get that advice, that training, and that support.
Yes, I agree with that. And there's no wrong door there as well. In so many areas of the country, of course, the chambers and the ITAs are co-located and work together very carefully and are there to support international trade. Indeed, just on our CEO call of the Chamber Network this morning, we had Minister Jayawardena from the DIT, and that's one of the things we were talking about, which is how does the Department for International Trade and the Chamber Network, public sector and the private sector, work as close together as possible to support businesses in this period. So totally agree with what you were saying there.
Thank you for that. We've got time for one very quick question and answer, if we can keep it brief. Ali Carnegie wanted to come in with a question about energy procurement. So Ali, are you still on the call? You are. Would you like to come in with that? I can't see you, Ali. Ali Carnegie, are you there?
On mute.
Alistair, can you? No, I can't see or hear you. Sorry, Alistair. If you've got time, type your question very briefly in the chat function, and we'll ask it in the last closing moments. But for some reason, I think we've got a slight technical issue there that we can't see or hear Alistair. Any other quick questions that can be a sort of 10-second question and a 10-second answer before we wrap up? Don't see any hands up. Don't see any extra questions in the chat. Sorry, Jason. Yes, go ahead very quickly.
Very quickly, collateral damage. How many tens of thousands of businesses are going to collapse?
We're going to lose lots of businesses, but in every economic crisis, we lose lots of businesses. I'll flip the question around and say, how many new businesses are we collectively going to create as we see how the world is changing? And use our entrepreneurial skills to best effect. I think seriously, there's going to be a lot of startups coming out of this crisis. Just will be some big business losses too, and some of those startups could be the next big thing. So we want to be there to support them too.
I'm glad you say that, Adam, because we have we've put in a paper to the Local Enterprise Partnership, the LEP, about working with them to support new startups, because there is no real new support. There's the Futures Fund, but that's really for businesses that already have significant investment, but there's nothing for those micros, nothing for those people who are currently furloughed or being made redundant to break out and be entrepreneurial. So I'm glad you say that. I think there's a real opportunity here, and we're going to support that with a small business toolkit with content provided by the members for the members, which has a whole bunch of advice on a whole range of subjects, 30-odd subjects around HR, tax, finance, branding, you name it. And we'll be using that to help support micros and startups. So that's really, really important. Ali Carnegie's managed to put his question in the chat, and we've got very, very quick question and answer. Sorry, Adam, if you can keep it short as possible. We are seeing more and more suppliers refusing to take on businesses in retail, leisure, food, which is going to lead to increased bills going forward, as more and more businesses will have no choice at renewal. Do you have any influence with the suppliers? So this Ali Carnegie is Total Energy Solutions. We're seeing more and more suppliers refusing to take on businesses in retail, leisure, food, which is going to lead to increased bills going forward, as more and more businesses will have no choice at renewal. Do you have any influence with the suppliers?
We do have conversations with some of the suppliers and, of course, with some of the government departments involved. I'd have to take that question on and, again, go back to my team on it. I am worried about a lot of businesses being shut out of various types of support. So, you know, being shut out by financial institutions, for example, being shut out on insurance, or being shut out on other core utilities. I wasn't aware of this particular issue until right now. So, Ali, if you don't mind, I'll take that on board. And again, Stuart will put it back to us, and we'll see what we can find out.
Yes, thank you, Adam, and thank you, Ali. I see we're coming to a conclusion now. So just to reiterate what we said at the start, we need those examples. We need those real world examples, case studies of what your issues are, what you want us to campaign for on your behalf. And I must wrap up by not just thanking Adam for appearing now and answering your questions and giving us a real insight to what's been going on behind the scenes, but the work they have done. He and his team have worked tirelessly 7 days a week for week upon week upon week to give support to you guys, and I'm really very grateful to them. And I can't imagine how difficult it's been for you guys as well, where you have been up late at night lobbying, speaking to ministers, trying to get the point across. You know, it's been pretty chaotic. So thank you to British Chambers of Commerce. Thank you to your team. And I'm going to do, as we end, unusual thing of unmuting everyone, and perhaps we can do an unusual round of applause to Adam Marshall and thank him for joining us.
All down to the team. with me.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you very much, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you next time.